Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Klara Maurova. Klara was nicknamed to be the cannibal mother and was one of 3 involved in the Kurram case. Basically, Klara met someone who convinced her to join this kind of a cult that was led by someone who was called the Doctor. After joining this cult, that same woman, who was called Barbara, started to convince Klara to commit certain crimes against her own family. A lot of these crimes are one that I unfortunately cannot even repeat here on YouTube. These crimes continued on for a year until somehow a neighbor of Carla's bought a nanny cam that was on the same frequency as one that Carla was using, and the neighbor's camera's feed ended up getting intercepted with Carla's, and this neighbor saw some of the crimes happening and took the evidence to the police. Thankfully, this was enough for the police to come and take Klara into custody and charge her. The boys involved were able to testify at the trial as well. In our number 9 spot today, we have Irma Grease. I don't care if I say any of these names right, they all suck. Irma was given the nickname the hyena of Auschwitz, and I think that really speaks for itself. She was a concentration camp guard and even went on to serve as warden of the women's section of Bergen-Belsen. There are many accounts of Irma and the crimes she committed, and they are all absolutely horrific. It is said that she was particularly cruel and stirred panic and fear in every prisoner that crossed her path. Apparently, she even had a lampshade that was made out of the skin of 3 separate prisoners, just as an example of how depraved she really was. These crimes caught up with her in the end, however, as in the spring of 1945 she was arrested along with 45 other people. She was accused of war crimes, and although she pleaded not guilty, the testimonies of witnesses and strong survivors allowed the truth to come out. She was convicted and sentenced to death, which occurred on December 13th, 1945. In our number 8 spot today, we have Leonarda Cianciulli. Better known as the soap maker of Correggio, Leonarda was an Italian serial killer who lived from 1883 until 1970. There are certainly people on this list who took more lives or did what could be considered more brutal things, but these crimes are absolutely chilling. Leonarda took the lives of 3 separate people and turned them into soap and tea cakes using caustic soda. Leonarda's son went to join the Italian army in preparation for World War II, and during this time she figured the only way to protect him was by doing human sacrifices. One of the worst parts of these crimes is that she fed these tea cakes she made to people who would come to visit, along with eating them herself and feeding them to her son. Authorities caught on to her crimes when one of her victims' family members began to get suspicious about the disappearance. In the end, Leonarda was arrested and charged and ended up being convicted to 30 years in prison and 3 years in a criminal asylum. In our number 7 spot today, we have Elizabeth Bathory. Elizabeth was a Hungarian noblewoman who lived from August of 1560 to August of 1614. While she was born into one of the oldest and most powerful families in Transylvania and was well educated and successful, she was also killing young women and bathing in their blood. Yeah, super weird and really not cool at all. Elizabeth has gone down as one of the most evil women in history because she was taking the lives of women who were her servants, and she was bathing in their blood because she believed it would keep her young. There's something that's telling me that this probably didn't work. I guess somebody should have told her about drinking water and leaving other people alone. It's way more efficient. Anyway, instead of being remembered as youthful and beautiful, Elizabeth is instead remembered as being a terrible, evil person who took the lives of somewhere from 175 to 200 women, but some accounts swear the number might be as high as 600. In our number 6 spot today, we have Herta Oberhauser. Herta was a German physician and convicted war criminal who performed absolutely horrific medical atrocities on prisoners at the Ravensbrück women's concentration camp. She was known for being a part of medical experiments like treating purposely infected wounds with sulfenamide, as well as bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration and transplantation. Herta was the only female that was a defendant in the Nuremberg doctors' trial, and she was convicted for crimes against humanity, but was only sentenced to 20 years in prison. She was released early for good behavior somehow, and ended up becoming a family doctor again in West Germany. That was until a survivor recognized her. Herta then had her medical license revoked and was fined. She tried to appeal but was rejected and never practiced medicine ever again. In our number 5 spot today, we have Myra Hindley. Myra is a woman who was in a relationship with a man called Ian Brady. Together, this couple has been referred to as, quote, 2 sadistic killers of the utmost depravity, and individually, Myra has been called the most evil woman in Britain. Between July of 1963 and October of 1965, these two together took the lives of 5 separate people. The pair were only charged for 3 killings, but both received life sentences under a whole life tariff. After being arrested, she of course tried to pin all of the crimes on Ian and make up excuses for the crimes, like saying that she was running a bath while one of them took place, so what was she supposed to do? do. Luckily, somehow the judge was able to see through this ironclad self-defense. She ended up making several appeals against her life sentence and claimed that she was a reformed woman, but for some reason no one believed that and she was never released. We have Karla Homolka. Karla is one of the worst Canadians out there. Karla, along with her partner Paul Bernardo, are often referred to as the Ken and Barbie killers, and while Paul started off his life of crime alone initially, he quickly brought Karla into it as well as the crimes only progressed and got worse. After being found out, Paul was arrested and charged for his crimes prior to their relationship, and together the pair was charged with taking the lives of 3 separate people, one of them being Karla's own sister. The investigation of the crimes was quite difficult and complicated, and unfortunately there was no choice but to offer Karla a plea deal. If she fully cooperated with the investigation, she would receive only a 12-year sentence in return, and she accepted. Both Paul and Karla were convicted in 2005, and while Paul still remains in prison, Karla served her 12-year sentence and has since been released. She left Canada for a while, but unfortunately has since returned. In our number 3 spot today we have Isle Cook. Isle was a war criminal who oversaw concentration camps that were run by her husband Carl Otto Cook. She is well known due to her sadistic and brutal treatment of prisoners, and she became one of the first well-known people that committed these types of crimes to be tried by the US military. It is said that those being held at the camps with distinctive tattoos, Isle would take pieces of their skin as souvenirs. When being charged with her crimes, they included things like private enrichment, embezzlement, as well as taking the lives of some prisoners to prevent them from testifying. In the original trial, she was acquitted for lack of evidence, although her husband was sentenced to death by an SS court in Munich. After a few more trials, however, she ended up being sentenced to life in prison, and despite multiple appeal attempts, she was never released. In our number 2 spot today we have Daria Nikolaevna Saltyakova. That's the best we're gonna get. Daria was a Russian noblewoman and a serial killer from Moscow. She became well known for killing many of her serfs, mostly women, which is kind of similar to Elizabeth, who we already talked about today. Because of her ties to the Russian royal court and other Russian nobility, complaints about the deaths at her estate were initially ignored and only resulted in punishments for those who did the complaining. Eventually, however, relatives of those who had been killed were able to bring a petition to Empress Catherine II, who then decided to try Daria publicly. Investigations took 6 long years, where the investigating official counted up to 138 suspicious deaths, basically all of which could likely be attributed to Daria. In the end, she was found guilty of 38 of these crimes, but the Empress wasn't quite sure what the punishment should be, as the death penalty had already been abolished in Russia. In the end, Daria was chained on a public platform and made to wear a sign around her neck that detailed the crimes she committed. After this form of punishment, she was sent to jail to serve out her life sentence. In our number 1 spot today we have Delphine LaLaurie. Delphine was a New Orleans socialite who was an evil person behind closed doors. It is said that in public, Delphine was polite and appeared as if she cared for those who were enslaved in her home, which is the most ridiculous sentence I've ever said, but that's what the accounts of people who lived at this time said. Delphine's social standing remained until, on April 10, 1834, authorities responded to a fire at her Royal Street mansion. When they arrived and went inside, no one was prepared for the horrors they were about to see, as they discovered bound slaves in her attic who had clear signs of violent behavior over a long period of time. Following this, her house was swarmed by an outraged group of New Orleans citizens, but somehow Delphine was able to escape with her family to France. While the angry group destroyed her entire home, Delphine never faced any punishments for her crimes, which is one of the most frustrating endings to this horrible, awful story.
Coming in at number 10 we have Diana Lovejoy. Diana Lovejoy freaked out so hard that she fainted when her guilty verdict was read out in court. The woman from Carlsbad in San Diego was arrested for a plot to kill her estranged husband. Diana and Walden McDavid Jr. conspired to kill Greg Mulvihill. The pair were in the middle of a divorce battle and it all got pretty ugly. The man survived a murder attempt, but Diana was still sentenced to 26 years to life in prison for her crime. Here's the moment the guilty verdict was read out.
After a gun rage, and at the word guilty, you hear a thud, then weeping in the gallery. A reporter from another station is trained as Joy was unconscious for a time, then taken to a hospital for treatment.
That's right, she straight up conks it in court. She was taken away in a stretcher. Coming in at number 9, we have Alexandria Thomas. Alexandria Thomas and her mother broke down during a hearing at the Palm Beach County Jail in Florida. The woman was accused of stabbing her boyfriend to death outside a supermarket in Palm Beach. She was standing before a judge who told her boyfriend was in a medically induced coma. The woman soon understood how serious the charges against her were, and this was her reaction.
Alexandria Thomas crying hysterically.
As you can see, it was all very intense. Here we have her mother outside of the courtroom, and she's still very emotional.
I know she's very worried about the victim who was her boyfriend who she loved very much.
Coming into number 8, we have Kay Andrea Cook. Kay Andrea's reaction to her sentencing went so viral that we could not discuss it in this video. The then teenager received 20 years for carjacking an elaborate dating app plot that ended in the shooting of another teenager. At the time, Kay Andrea was 18, and when she was read her 20-year sentence, this is what happened first.
Years in state prison.
So yeah, that's her mother screaming and crying and losing it. I honestly feel like her mum really set her off, because this was then Kay Andrea's response. Yep, neither of them took it well. It was very emotional, and honestly, it's pretty stressful to watch. Coming into number 7, we have Mitchell Blair. 36-year-old Mitchell Blair was a mother of 4 who killed 2 of her children, 9-year-old Stephen Berry and 13-year-old Stoney Blair. She put their bodies in a freezer, so not a great mum. The woman was sentenced to life in jail without parole, meaning that she would never be released. Throughout her much publicized trial, Mitchell broke down with outbursts many times. One example is right here. This came during a custody hearing for her 2 surviving children. She screams she did kill her daughter, getting very irate. She said that the girl had abused her other children, but the court found no evidence of that. She was removed from the courtroom a number of times. Coming into number 6, we have Kayla Ray Norton. So this actually wasn't a life sentence, but it was a pretty long sentence and a fierce reaction. White supremacist Kayla Ray Norton and Jose Torres gatecrashed a black 8-year-old's birthday party with guns and a Confederate flag in Douglasville in July 2015. Now the pair were just part of a wider group, but the group did repeatedly use the N-word to the children. Now this was deemed as racially motivated. It also came a month after fellow supremacist Dylan Roof killed 9 African Americans in a church, so it was a very sensitive time. Anyway, we can all agree that this was awful behaviour from Kayla and friends, and this was her reaction to her 6-year sentence.
Not me. That's not me. That's not him. I would never walk up.
She did seem pretty sorry. She broke down in tears, and she did say she accepted her sentence. The next freakout also comes from regular sentencing, but it is so intense I had to include it. Coming into number 5, we have the Vegas lady who is not done talking. So okay, I know that this isn't a life sentence or anything, but the way in which she freaks out rivals a lot of the freakouts on this list, and I thought you might want to see it. I basically just found this footage by googling woman freaks out in court, so like the details are a bit sketchy here. It seems like this woman has done something dubious in Las Vegas, and she's in court hearing about her crime and the fact that she'll likely go to jail. She tries to explain herself, but the judge is like, shh. This is her reaction to being silenced.
Yes, you are. Let me go. I got kids and responsibilities. Y'all, let me go. Let me go.
Whoa. The leg kicking is super intense. Then, when you think that she's been calmed, she comes out with this.
Respect her all goddamn. Sorry, bitch. I
If she wasn't going to jail before, she certainly is now. Okay, we have a lot of recent history lady drama, but one of the most intense and horrifying reactions to a sentence in history comes way back from 1541 at the execution of Lady Margaret Pole. Now this is one of the most gruesome and memorable trials of all time. Check it out at number 4. Poor Margaret was arrested by King Henry VIII and his henchmen. She was brought for execution at the Tower of London without trial, so basically her trial was that day, found her guilty, and yeah, her head was coming off. On the 27th of May, a summer's morning, Lady Margaret proclaimed that she was not going to lay her head on the execution block, and if the executioner wanted to decapitate her, he would have to do it where she stood. He did it, but he missed her neck, and she ran around screaming, scratching, and hissing. She literally spat blood at those who wrongly accused her. Eventually, after 11 blows, she was killed, but it's said that her ghost still haunts the Tower of London today. Coming into number 3, back with more modern history, we have this Dallas woman. Mother Elizabeth Escalona abused her daughter, beating her and gluing her hands to the wall. She was shown pictures of her 2-year-old toddler's injuries. Now the little girl was left near death following her mother's savagery. The 23-year-old woman was sentenced to 99 years in jail, longer than usual life terms. When she's read the sentence, her reaction is very strong.
Penitentiary for a period of 99 years. The sentence goes into effect today. As required by law, you will receive all back time credits. Counsel, is there any reason?
We can't see her face, but her body doubles over in shock. She cries, but the real freak out comes from the woman's mother, who screams the house down.
Counsel, is there any reason in law why sentence should not be pronounced at this time? Safely held, to be turned over to duly authorized.
It's actually heartbreaking on so many levels. I'm really glad the toddler survived, if there is any silver lining here. Okay, you're gonna need to prepare your ears for number 2. We have this Miami screamer. This is so intense. A woman who lived in Miami was arrested for killing her husband, a crime that would carry a life sentence. As she meets with a judge in a bail hearing in 2013, she applies for bond, but she is denied. This was her reaction. She is distressed and also scantily dressed. She's wheeled in a wheelchair, and she seems like clothing has been placed over her rather than on her. I'm not quite sure what's going on here.
Your Honor, if I may.
Me tengo que ir a la cárcel así, pero mi marido me pegó. Si eres el que me rompió la pierna, por favor, my husband broke my leg. Please, no, don't do that. I have my leg broke.
Anyway, she screams that her husband broke her legs, seeming to confess to the killing, but in self-defense. Seriously, she is screaming at that judge. Finally, coming into number 1, this is one of the most dramatic things I have ever seen in some courtroom footage. We have the trial of Erica Mae Butts and Shanita Latrice Cunningham. A double whammy and truly sad. The pair were sent to prison for the rest of their lives for beating toddler Serenity Richardson to death. The child's godmother, Erica Mae, and her lover, Shanita, beat the 3-year-old girl, with their defense being, and I quote, "We didn't know what we did would kill her," right? The women caused a courtroom stir. In November 2011, when their sentences were read, first cries and screams are heard as the sentences run out. Then, things get even more dramatic. Both of the women on trial collapse and fall to the floor. The screams we then decipher are coming from the gallery from Erica Mae's mother. It's honestly one of the most intense things I've ever seen. The women are attended to by medics and the mother is escorted out by security, but she's screaming out the door. The whole thing is total chaos. We hear another woman screaming, "Get up, Erica!" Like, she's fainted, I really don't think she can hear you. Then as she comes to, she's dragged out of the courtroom on a wheelie chair, and her girlfriend before her was too, and it's all very intense. She's hyperventilating very loudly, and I just want done with this footage.
Coming up at our number 10 spot, we have Julia Brown. Now, Julia Brown is from a small town in Louisiana, and she was known to be a pretty terrifying witch in her time. She became known as a witch because she would perform spells and had charms, and yes, she would place curses on people. Yeah, this is a real person, folks. Apparently, she would perform rituals for people in the town and do spells for them, and eventually they began to take advantage of her, and that is when things took a turn. She started to tell people that bad things were going to happen to them. She would make predictions for them, such as tell them their death dates, and that really creeped a lot of people out. She loved to sing, and at some point she created a song about how she was going to get revenge on the town when she died. "When I die, I'm taking the town with me," she sang. Well, as you might have already guessed, when she died, she certainly got revenge on the town. As her casket was being lowered, rain fell on the town, and that rain eventually turned into a hurricane that wiped out the town. Yep, she might be scarier than a demon. It's possible. In our number 9 spot, we have Moll Dyer. It is unclear if Moll Dyer was a real person or if she was just a legend. People say that she was real, however, there have been no documents to prove this to date, so for the purpose of this video, we are going to say she was probably real. And by real, I mean a real witch, a real scary witch. Moll lived in Maryland in the 17th century. She apparently had tormentors when she was alive and put a curse on them before she died. She died running away from them and froze to death on a rock that the town still displays today, as apparently you can still see her handprint on the rock. The ancestors of her tormentors apparently are all cursed with bad luck. Well, all I can say is I would not want to marry into one of their families. Also, how do we know that they are still cursed with bad luck if they are, born and then told that they are cursed with bad luck? Because maybe they have attracted it now because they believe that they have bad luck. I say those people need to leave the town, forget this legend, and see if the next generation has bad luck, and then we will have proof if this curse has actually continued. Moll was spoken about in the famous movie The Blair Witch Project, in which I have not seen, but probably should. In our number 8 spot, we have Kate Batts. This is probably one of the scariest witches on this list. Kate Batts was a neighbor to a man named John Bell, and apparently was a witch tormenting John and his family from her grave. Very powerful. John and his daughter Betsy were tormented in many different ways. Betsy was attacked apparently by an unknown force, and they would both hear chain sounds and always feel on edge. Eventually, the entity that was tormenting them told them that she was their former neighbor, Kate Batts, and that she was going to destroy their family. Eventually, John was found dead with a small vial of liquid beside him, believed to be poison from Kate the entity. Apparently, she stopped tormenting the family after John passed. Why she was tormenting the family is unknown, but perhaps it was because John did something bad to her when she was alive. That's the only explanation I can think of. Perhaps his guilty conscience could have concocted the whole story. That feels possible as well. In our number 7 spot, we have Gerald Gardner. Known as the creator of Wicca, a religious version of witchcraft, Gerald Gardner is arguably scarier than a demon to some, but perhaps just an egotistical man to most. In 1954, he wrote a book called Witchcraft Today, and it became widely popular around the world, and it helped pave the way for more widespread acceptance of witchcraft. So even though that has done a lot of good for the community, he is a bit of a controversial character that may have caused harm as well. A lot of people are angry at the fact that he became known as the founder of Wicca when he himself did not actually find it. He just wrote a book about it and then got credited for it. This has angered many witches around the world, and many people are frustrated that he has claimed the title of founder when he indeed is not. Nobody likes a faker, and it does not do any good for the religion to have its leader be dishonest. Coming up in our number 6 spot, we have La Voisine. Catherine, aka La Voisine, was a witch in the 1600s in France who would do spells, mix potions, and tell fortunes to the townspeople. Apparently, she would hold black masses, and she would channel the devil. She really grew to fame when she discovered that a lot of wives wanted their husbands to pass away, and so she created potions to help them do so. She gained quite a bit of fortune from these potions. After some time, she became more and more dark as she began to take the lives of innocent people as a sacrifice for the devil, and eventually she was arrested for killing many people, and she was, burned at the stake. This woman seems absolutely terrifying, and I am so glad that I live in 2020 2022 and not the 16th century. Definitely seems more terrifying than a demon. On second thought, perhaps she was actually one. In our number 5 spot, we have Agnes Sampson. Agnes was a well-known healer in her time, which was around 1590, when the King of Scotland single-handedly started the witch trials around the world due to his paranoia over witches and his belief that a witch was the cause for a few big storms in Scotland. Talk about paranoid. Heesh. Anyways, Agnes was one of the witches that was captured during this time and tortured and thrown in jail. She was known for her healing potions that worked like magic, and so naturally she was accused of being a witch. They didn't have naturopaths back then, so there's that. Anyways, turns out they were right to accuse her because while in jail she actually confessed and said that she worshipped Satan and that she even was physically involved with him, if you catch my drift. So yeah, after this, she was sentenced to death. In our number 4 spot, we have Anne Hibbins. In the 1650s, there was a woman by the name of Anne Hibbins who was accused of being a witch. And perhaps she was, but maybe not in the typical way like the others on this list. Perhaps she was just not a great person and her personality was scarier than a demon and she perhaps got what she deserved. Apparently, Anne was a very wealthy woman, being very connected, and her brother-in-law was a future governor of Massachusetts and her husband was a civil law officer. Her husband apparently condemned a woman for being a witch. When he passed away, she was left a bit in ruin and she wasn't very well liked. She had sued a bunch of carpenters years prior that her community loved, and that made people hate her. She was then accused of being a witch and sentenced to death. There's not too many reports on her, so it's hard to say if she really was a nasty woman or not, but if she was, then all I can say is this sounds like the case of Queen Karma herself. In our number 3 spot, we have Alice Keitler. Alice Keitler was one of the first witches known in Ireland. She apparently was married 4 times and outlived all of her husbands. Yep, of course that was unusual for this period, which was the 13th century. All of her husbands died mysteriously, and after every one, people grew more and more suspicious of her, naturally. Until her final husband died, then his kids accused her of poisoning him. Eventually, rumors began to spread that she had killed her husbands as offerings to the devil himself. She also wasn't very well liked in the town, so that didn't help her case either. But apparently she had been worshipping him for decades. People began pushing for her to be captured and to have a formal trial, but before they were able to, she fled the country, thus proving that she probably did kill her husbands. She might not have been a witch, but it's definitely possible she was. In our number 2 spot, we have Malin Matsdottir. Malin and her husband were either evil or they were being possessed, because their story really gives me the creeps. In 1676, Malin's husband was sentenced to death for being inappropriate with an animal. Makes me sick. And Malin was accused of being a witch by her own daughter. Her daughter said that she would worship the devil. Apparently, many young ones went missing in her town, and people believed that she snatched them and sacrificed them. At her trial, she was accused of taking them, and since her daughter was among the accusers, she had no chance. She was sentenced to death. She died without a sound, which confirmed to many that she was a real witch because they apparently don't feel pain. Guys, maybe she was a real witch. If I get too close to the oven and feel the heat, I react. So if I was her, I would have made my exit the most dramatic show anyone would ever see. So dramatic people would laugh and wish they hadn't burned me. In our number 1 spot, we of course have Aleister Crowley. Not all witches are women, folks. Probably the worst witch that I have ever read about was a male, and he was the darkest they come. People called him the wickedest man to have ever existed. Scarier than a demon. In fact, he was probably Satan himself. Of course, I'm speaking of Aleister Crowley, who was alive not too long ago. Close to 100 years ago, he was being kicked out of Italy for his occult gatherings, where it is believed that he channeled Satan and everyone danced naked under the moon. Such fun. He would refer to himself as the Beast or the Antichrist. He traveled around the world promoting his religion called Thelma and promoted his teachings. He wrote many books, including the Book of Thoth, the Book of Lies, and the Book of the Law. The scary thing about Aleister is that people still follow his teachings today.
Starting us off at number 10 is Queen Rani Lakshmi Bai, also known as Rani of Jhansi. Born in 1828, this Indian queen ruled over the state of Jhansi during the 1850s. She was was a central figure during the 1857 Indian Rebellion, and most people know her as India's Joan of Arc. And if you know Joan's story, then you already know she was a badass. She would wrestle, weightlift, and steeplechase all before breakfast, which was amazing for a female to be doing in the 1800s. Rani wasn't born into royalty, but she married into it when she wed the Maharaja Gangadhar Rao Nevalkar in 1842. The couple had a son who died within months, so they adopted one of the Maharaja's sons as their own. After the king died, British officials refused their adopted son's claim to the throne and wanted to annex Jhansi. Rani was like, hell no, I'm not giving you my land. When the rebellion against the British started, there was a massacre of 40 to 60 European officers, and it's still debated whether the Queen was directly involved in it or not. Her forces did later defeat the mutineers during the siege. When the place was going up, she rode off on her horse with her son on her back. The horse died, but they somehow survived. In June, a squadron came down on them and she actually dressed up as a cavalry soldier and killed some troops. She was already wounded without a horse and just bleeding on the road before a troop came and shot her to death. Now, I don't think Rani was an evil queen per se. She loved her people and fought for them, but I'm sure in the British view at the time they thought she was evil. But maybe you shouldn't colonize half the world then, Britain, you know? Coming in at number 9 is Queen Consort Frédégonde of Soissons. There's a lot of debate whether Frédégonde was a queen, a woman that just wanted to survive, or a full-on murderer. Her story is very much started from the bottom now we're here kind of vibe. She started off as King Chilperic's I's servant, then moved out to become his concubine, and finally she managed to seduce him to leave his first wife, Odovera. I know I may have pronounced that wrong, I think it's Odovera. Either way, they put her in a convent, and that sucks for her. And just imagine how much control she must have had, since Odovera was powerful even without the king, since she was a Merovingian queen. This is already a queen. She's taken down by a servant, concubine. But the fight wasn't over yet, because in a few years the king then married his second wife, Galswith, who was the older sister of Queen Brunhild of Metz. I'm sorry you guys, there's a lot of hard pronunciations in this video and I'm only a mere mortal. Now, to get rid of her second obstacle, Frédégonde convinced the king to kill her, and mere days after their wedding she was found strangled in her own bed. That obviously didn't go down well with Brunhild, who then had a feud with Frédégonde for 40 years. But she didn't give a damn. She assassinated the queen's husband via poisoned axe, then tried to kill her brother-in-law, the king of Burgundy. She then tried to kill their son, and then she tried to kill the queen herself. So when I tell you this woman had no mercy or remorse, I am not exaggerating. Queen Consort Frédégonde was essential for the king, since she was good at arranging discreet or not so discreet assassinations. Queen Brunhild then married Frédégonde's stepson Merovich, and they tried to take the couple over. But the Queen Consort forged a secret alliance with Duke Guntram of Metz, an enemy of her husband, and kidnapped Merovich and killed him. King Chilperic just believed his son had somehow stabbed himself to death and never asked his concubine about it. I hope you guys are following. I put a lot of effort into this. Just ignore my pronunciations. At number 8 we have Queen Tamar of Georgia, born way back in 1160. Tamar was born into royalty since her dad was King George III of Georgia. Now, after a bloody revolt led by conspirators, George made Tamar his co-ruler in 1178, which was heavily opposed after he died. Look at the year, do you think they would have ever been okay with a woman being in charge? Absolutely not. It's 1178. She divorced her first husband after realizing he was not only gay but also an alcoholic, and this guy Yuri was so pissed he tried to stage a coup against her twice, and she just swatted him away like a fly. Her second husband David supported her in every way, and that's the kind of man she needed. That's the kind of man we all need. Now, Tamar was sometimes called King Tamar, which is very interesting. She expanded and took over her neighboring territories with no mercy. She would take her army and reduce local princes to nothing. They would siege and ransack Muslim districts and fortresses and just take them. Despite not caring about literally anyone but herself, her power, and her territory, Tamar made her empire incredibly strong and stable by enacting a kind of feudal system. Hey, kudos to her for standing her ground, but you also don't have to kill everyone you see, you know? Filling at number 7 slot is Queen Zenobia. This may be the oldest queen I've mentioned in this series thus far. Born in 240 AD, this 3rd century queen's history and parentage is very much debated. Since information about her is so scarce, no one is quite sure whether she was born royal or not, but based on her level level of education, she was definitely not a commoner. Some sources even say she was Cleopatra's descendant, which is kind of insane. She married King Septimius Odaenathus, who ruled over Palmyra and later the whole east, and crowned his oldest son as his co-ruler. Zenobia went with them on all their campaigns, and the soldiers really liked her for morale. She was probably hot, I'm not gonna lie to you. Sadly, the king and his son were assassinated by their cousin, after which Zenobia soon took over. Now there's some conspiracies claiming she was involved in planning the assassination because she didn't approve of her stepson on the throne, but some people say she was actually there when they got assassinated and she was just spared, who knows. Septimius controlled a huge part of the Roman East and was the highest military and political authority in the region, so for Zenobia to take that over was pretty damn tough. She demanded allegiance and later invaded Egypt just to have another trade route to the river Euphrates. She didn't have to do it, the normal route wasn't completely blocked, but she just had that zeal and ambition. She appeased everyone she ruled over and was a Syrian monarch, Roman empress, Hellenistic queen who people loved. However, she kind of just declared herself Empress of Rome, which caused her to be called a usurper, and her death very much soon followed. Now at number 6 is Qasim Sultan. And I tried to Google pronounce how to say this name because it is a Turkish name, but I couldn't find anything, so I think it's Qasim. Don't hate me if I'm wrong. Now Qasim was one of, if not the most powerful women in Ottoman history who had a very humble beginning. Now her dad was a priest and she was bought as a slave and sent to be a harem for Sultan Ahmed I. Qasim was his favorite and gave him multiple children, and therefore many of them were princesses, giving her power. The Sultan liked her so much that in 1612 he ordered a woman to be brutally beaten just because she had irritated his beloved. She was in power from 1605 to 1617, and first ascended to power when her son Murad IV became the Sultan. She outlived most of her male family members and had to act as regent thrice. It was said she was willing to kill anyone just to make sure her sons were on the throne, aka she was on the throne because they were all far too young. Her downfall eventually came when her daughter-in-law assassinated her in 1651. Trust no one. It's gonna be your damn own who do it. Coming in at number 5 is Elizabeth I, aka the Virgin Queen or Gloriana, which I've never heard of. Gloriana, who's called her that? Now as a daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, whose marriage got annulled, Elizabeth was ruled an illegitimate child. She was imprisoned during Mary I's reign for supposedly supporting the Protestant cause. After she finally died in 1558, Elizabeth became the queen and quickly established an English Protestant church. And the woman was actually really well liked. She didn't meddle too much in international affairs until war was literally knocking on her door, and she was celebrated for her virginity. Even though she was low-key in love with Robert Dudley her whole life, but we can just sweep that under the rug. But since Mary had made her life hell for not being a Catholic, Elizabeth abolished the Catholic Church. And despite saying she was tolerant of all religions, she was oppressing all the Catholics. Supporting Catholicism was an unlawful offense, wherein the monarchy could have you beaten, imprisoned, have your property taken away, or just full on execute you. She also made Mary Queen of Scots' life hell since the French wanted her in power, and Elizabeth obviously did not. She hated Mary since some thought Mary was the heir to the English throne, since under Catholic and Protestant law, Elizabeth was illegitimate. So the two just made each other's lives hell. And number 4 is Tomoe Gozen. Born around 1157, Tomoe was a Onna Gugeisha, also known as a female warrior. It's actually debated whether she was a real historical figure or someone in literature, but I'm just going to treat her as she was real. Her father supported Lord Kiso since her family had ties to him, and she's best known for serving him during the Genpei War and in the Battle of Owazu. As beautiful as she was an even more skilled archer and swordswoman. Tomoe was literally ready to face any demon or devil in her way. She'd ride untrained horses and was utterly fearless, to the point Lord Kiso would send her out in battle first. Sometimes referred to as the first general of Japan, in 1182 she commanded over 300 samurai against 2,000 rival clan warriors. Her side lost the Battle of Owazu, and apparently she beheaded the leader of the Musashi clan and presented it to her master. I don't think she's evil at all. I think she's a full-fledged badass, and I'm here for it. Filling Coming at number 3 slot is Empress Catherine the Great. Born in 1729, Catherine was the Empress of Russia for 34 years, making her the country's longest ruling female ever. Born into royalty, her dad was a German prince and her first 2 cousins became kings of Sweden later on. When she first arrived in Russia, no one had any idea that this random irrelevant German princess would somehow eventually marry Tsar Peter III. Now Peter was quite unpopular since he was an alcoholic, and Catherine met him at age 10 and hated him. She would stay at one end of the castle while he was on the other end. She learned Russian and became super fluent to the point she would wake up in the middle of the night and practice her lessons, which gave her pneumonia. But she would do anything for the crown. Once they got married, she had a string of affairs and the palace started hating Peter more and more. Then in 1762 she launched a coup against Peter and overthrew him, becoming the queen, and later went on to assassinate him. Zaddy, you literally killed your own husband for the throne, but then again she hated him, so really, whatever. Now number 2 is Queen Boudica. Now she was the queen of the British Celtic Iceni tribe who eventually led an uprising against the forces of the Roman Empire. Boudica was of royal parentage and her husband Prasutagus was the king of the Iceni, which is current day Norfolk. When her husband was killed, troops from the Roman Emperor took her and tortured her. Her daughters and her tribe's money was all taken. Not taking this lightly at all, she came back with a vengeance with 100,000 Iceni troops and fought Legio IX Hispania and killed nearly 80,000 people. People said that she was a treacherous lioness who butchered the governors who had been left to give a fuller voice and strength to the endeavors of Roman rule. She was so close to being victorious when she was tragically captured, and instead of being killed, she killed herself. Again, I don't think Boudica was evil. In war, especially in those times, you have to kill people for your own people's sake. It's your people or your rivals' people. And finally, at number 1 is Queen Maria Eleonora of Sweden. Now, born into royalty, Maria was a German princess before she married King Gustav II Adolphus of Sweden in 1620. And they were both suited to each other, you know, they had the same interests and actually loved each other, and it was more than just a political marriage. But Maria was extremely ill-tempered, jealous, neurotic, and just plain dramatic. She said whatever she thought and spared no one, not even her own husband. A year after their marriage, she suffered a miscarriage that made her quite depressed, and she really wanted to give Gustav a son. She gave birth to a daughter who died, and her third child, who was a boy, ended up being stillborn due to a yacht accident. Then finally in 1626 she gave birth to Princess, later Queen Christina, and due to her depression and erratic behavior, she wasn't told her gender till a few days after the birth. When she found out, she said, "Instead of a son, I'm given a daughter, dark and ugly with a great nose and black eyes. Take her from me, I will not have such a monster." There started the multiple attempts of Maria trying to kill Christina. She once pushed her down the stairs, another time she dropped a heavy beam on her cradle, one of her nursemaids dropped her on the floor and injured her shoulder, but I don't know how that was accidental. The worst was when she made Christina sleep under the rotting heart of her then dead father Gustav. This woman was a monster.
Coming in at number 10, I'm waiting for this one to be made in some kind of like epic, sexy, ancient Roman spy movie, because starting at number 10 we have Mistress Marcia. Mistress Marcia was responsible for the demise of Roman Emperor Commodus. But not only was she his assassin, she was also his most favored concubine. Talk about keeping your enemies closer, eh Marcia? Marcia Aurelius Gionia Demetrius, along with most of Rome, wasn't a fan of this great leader. He was arrogant, would kill off his officials randomly, and tried to rename Rome after himself. But Marcia was skilled at managing his temper and even convinced him to release the Christians sentenced to labor in the Sardinian mines. But in 192 AD, Commodus wanted to appear next to the gladiators instead of the traditional place all rulers took in the palace. Marcia tried to convince him how much that would offend Rome, but Commodus took that as a slight and instead of brushing it aside, condemned her to death the following morning. Overreaction. Enraged, Marcia leapt into action once she discovered his plan. It was typical of the mistress to feed the emperor wine after his bath every night, so she enlisted the help of 2 conspirators and poisoned the cup. Unfortunately, it only made him violently ill and not dead, so they paid an athlete to strangle him to death. Marcia then married her fellow slave and lover Eclectus before they were both caught and killed a year later for the crime. Still, Took him a year to figure it out. Not bad, Marcia.
Julia Tofana. This next woman found a deadly way to help young maidens escape unwanted marriages. Back at a time when women had no social or financial protection if they did not have a man beside them, many young ladies were used as pawns to negotiate wealth and status for their families, even unwillingly. Which meant many had no protection should they be trapped in an abusive marriage, which is where our home ec assassin comes in. Born in Palermo, Italy, Julia sold poisons that were effective in helping divorces come along by, let's say, natural causes. Though not much is known about the woman herself, Julia would become one of the most famous hitwomen in history for providing a poison called aqua tofana. Disguised as a necessary tonic for women to use, the substance was a combination of arsenic, belladonna, and lead, all of which were actually found in makeup. Oops. Belladonna was used to expand the pupils so women would look more alluring, for example. But aqua tofana was the perfect tasteless and odorous concoction to pour into husband's end of the day ale. She kept a steady business for 50 years, long enough to involve her daughter before she was discovered. One of her clients apparently had second thoughts before pouring her husband some soup, and that eventually revealed the scheme. Julia killed over 600 men before the death of her and her accomplices. Coming in at number 8. Charlotte Corday, the assassin of Marat. If you paid attention in history class, you know how bloody and ruthless the French Revolution was. Heads flew everywhere, the prisons were filled with nobles, rioters filled the streets. Needless to say, it wasn't a great place to be, but Charlotte Corday had a mission. Charlotte was a passionate supporter of the revolution, even though its main conspirators were set on killing the likes of her. Charlotte was, after all, a noblewoman, though she opposed the reign of terror. There were two sides to the fray, the Girondists and the Jacobins, and Charlotte fought along the first. But the Jacobins were radical and tried to kill any and all oppositionists, the Girondists included, which is why Charlotte decided that Jean-Paul Marat, leader of the Jacobins and journalist, had to get the hell out. You gotta admire her gumption, man, because she just stormed in while this guy was taking a bath. She bought a knife, disguised herself as an informant, and went in to speak to him. At first she delivered on her offer and told him of escaped Girondins, but he had once said that they should be guillotined, so she whipped out her knife and ended his bath time once and for all. Corday knew she was going to be caught, however, and had told not even her family of her plans. Charlotte was guillotined on July 17, 1793, with her name attached to her dress so she would be recognized. She wrote in a letter explaining her actions, "I desire only that my head carried through Paris may be a rallying standard for all the friends of the law." That's commitment right there. Next up, at number 7, we have Idoia Lopez Riaño, also known as La Tigresa, the Tigress. Man, wicked names. Make it so hard not to think they're bad. I mean, they killed people. That's bad. The Tigress was a leading commander in a deadly political group aimed at earning independence of the Basque region of Spain. The group was responsible for the death of 800 people in the years before it was disbanded in 2018. She was responsible for planting a bomb in the center of Madrid in 1986, killing 12 police officers. After killing 5 more police a year later, at aged 22, La Tigresa made it onto the most wanted list. But what's even more disturbing was her tendency to seduce the police she killed before the bombings took place, even killing their colleagues across multiple days. When she was finally caught in 1994, she accumulated a sentence of 2,000 years in prison. However, she was released only 23 years later after several apologies and quitting the ETA. She is now studying to be a journalist. Okay, makes you wonder, does that count as getting away with it? Coming in at number 6, Brigitte Monhop. Brigitte Monhop was known at one time for being the most evil woman in Germany. She killed over 9 people throughout her involvement in the West Germany far leftist terrorist group, the Red Army. In fact, she ran it. She became the head of the RAF after its 4 previous leaders were caught and committed suicide in jail. They orchestrated a reign of terror across West Germany in the 1970s, killing over 30 people, with Brigitte being responsible for 9. She was known for her extravagant murder attempts and her cold and calculating behavior. Once she even handed a bouquet of flowers before shooting them point blank in the face. She was finally arrested in 1982 and, like Rihanna, was supposed to spend life in prison. But to the country's surprise and horror, Brigitte was released on parole in 2007 at the age of 57. Monhop has never shown remorse for any of her victims to this day, but she keeps a low profile. Next up at number 5, we have an assassin who continues to work to this day, but for the other side. Kim Yeon-hui was just 19 when she was handpicked at her university to become a spy for the North Korean government. Her mission? To disrupt the Seoul Olympics in 1987 and show the world that South Korea was too dangerous to be a host.
How? Well, after training for years as a spy, when Kim was just 25, she boarded a Boeing passenger plane and stored a bomb in the overhead compartment. Her and her assumed father got off at Abu Dhabi, but the bomb was detonated before it reached Seoul, killing 115 people. She says that her mission was personally assigned by Kim Jong II, and it was to help prevent South Korea from becoming more powerful than the North. She was brainwashed into thinking that this mission was for the sake of uniting Korea, and this was the very reason the president of South Korea pardoned her. Hyun-hee and her partner were intercepted and caught in Bahrain, but she didn't have time to use the cyanide like her partner did. She confessed after a week of interrogation. Today, she is married to a former South Korean spy and is the mother of 2 children. She is now trying to warn the world not to trust North Korea's current leader, Kim Jong-un. Due to the information she has shared, Hyun-hee thinks she's on the list to be assassinated next. Coming in at number 4, this is another one that needs to be a movie. Oh wait, it is, called Hidden Man. This is a tale of epic proportions of honor, struggle, but most importantly, for this video, vengeance. In 1911, China was in turmoil while many local warlords were trying to fight for power. Shi Qianchao's father, who had fought in the wars leading to the fall of the empire before, was captured and killed by a rival warlord named Sun Chuanfang. That day, his fate was sealed. She plotted for years and finally set the date for November 13th, 1935. After the warlord retired, he became a Buddhist at a temple in Tianjin, and she followed pistol in hand. Posed as a dedicated follower, she waited until everyone in the room had their eyes closed before she shot her father's killer. She then scattered letters and a photo of her father to assure everyone in the room that her task was complete and that she would not hurt any of them. The media caught wind of this assassination and swept up her name following words such as courageous, brave, and her case saw 3 trials before she was pardoned in 1936. I guess the public loves a good revenge story, but of course, who doesn't? That's why you're here. Coming in at number 3, we have La Tosca, another bad name lighting up the list. Maria Lopez, also known as La Tosca, was caught after completing 20 murders by the time she reached only 26 years old. She was reportedly paid $1,700 a month by the infamous Mexican drug cartel Los Zeta to complete her hit list. Los Zeta are allegedly responsible for over 14 drug-selling hotspots in Monterrey and are currently battling the Gulf Cartel for territory. Until her arrest in 2012, La Tosca was responsible for hitting rival traffickers and any police officers that got in the way. She's also accused of leading a criminal cell responsible for even more crimes, including torture and carjacking. Though she definitely isn't the only female assassin involved in the cartels, she's yet to be topped for number of kills. Coming in at number 2, we have Jeanette Van Nessen. We cannot have a list of top 10 female assassins without talking about Jeanette Van Nessen. But before we do, remember to tell us you like us by pressing that thumbs up button. Now, especially over COVID, many of us may now be familiar with freelance work, but hopefully not this kind. Jeanette worked as a freelance assassin charging 80,000 euros per hit. Most of her kills took place in South America, but unfortunately for her, she took one hit too far. She was hired by the Black September organization to kill an Israeli intelligence agent named Carl, which she did after she seduced him. But unbeknownst to her, as soon as she did, she put a target on her back. Abner Kaufman made it his own personal mission to take her down and eventually cornered her in her boathouse along with another agent. But she wasn't gonna go down that easy, and she slipped off her robe in an attempt to seduce Abner. But then the charade shattered when she reached for her gun. Bang bang, they shot her down and she died holding her cat. I just think that's great. If you want to see a dramatic presentation of this scene, just watch the film Munich, directed by Steven Spielberg. Coming in, last but not least, number 1, Freddy and Truus Overstegen. Who says the best assassins work alone? No assassin I've met, that's for sure, mostly because I haven't met any that I know of. Sister duo Freddy and Truus Overstegen fought back against the German occupation during World War II and never revealed how many soldiers they killed. When the war was about to begin, their mother took in Jewish refugees and hid them in their house. Soon the 2 girls, then later along with their friend Hani, took a more deadly approach to resistance. Freddy joined the Dutch resistance when she was just 14, soon followed by Truus. In the 1940s, when the Netherlands were invaded, the 3 girls took on the role of ambushing and seducing SS soldiers and their Dutch collaborators straight to their death. Soon the teens began to take on shooting missions by themselves. In 1943 they met Hani, who dropped out of school when she refused to sign allegiance to Germany. All 3 of them became excellent shooters, but Hani was captured just 3 weeks before the war ended. Her last words apparently were, "I'm a better shot," when her executioner only wounded her. Both Truce and Freddie survived the war and both died at the age of 92 in 2016. It was only after their deaths that they received national recognition. After all is fair in love and war, and these two women helped fight a war that would haunt generations to come.
Starting us off at number 10 is a classic witch. First up, we have a story from Louis 92, and they start off by explaining that their grandfather used to be a rancher in Mexico, and that this was a story he used to tell often when they were young. Quote, "One day he said he was patrolling this ranch late at night and he heard a baby crying. Now, the land is pretty flat, so he looked all ways and saw nothing. Maybe some goats out in the far distance, since they sound like crying babies. As he's walking his route, he hears the same sound, looks up in the sky, and he swears he saw a witch with black clothing and everything flying towards a mountain. He panicked, ran to his car, and drove off as fast as he could." I mean, no kidding. If I saw a witch riding a broom in the sky while I was alone at night, I would definitely be freaked out too. Moving on to number 9, a coven. Next up is a story posted to Reddit about 9 years ago from Astrius94, and it would definitely freak me out to say the least. Quote, "About 5 years ago, me and my friends were just messing around in a smallish local forest. Basically, we saw in the distance, in a little forest clearing, a group of 4, 5, 6-ish people, what looked like to be wearing black hooded robes, sitting together on the ground quietly. I know it seems typical, but there was no normal reason for anyone to be dressed like that in the middle of a forest. We just all freaked out and ran after watching for about 20 seconds. I still remember the image of them sitting there vividly all these years later." Coming in at number 8, a psychic witch. This next one comes from Reddit user Bubblegum Scent, and they begin by explaining, "She knew a woman who lived in the middle of nowhere, really far from town. She went to her one day with her mom. Quote, this woman was eerie, that energy that also scares you because you think she can see through you, but there was nothing wrong with her face or hair or anything. She was average looking, except for her gold grills all around her mouth. She first did a ritual with water and green leaves from a mango tree on us, chanting some stuff we didn't understand and passing these leaves in the fire. She said she needed to clean us of energy from the outside. Reddit friend explains that she's a very private person, so she hadn't shared any details with the woman when she arrived, but when this witch opened her cards, Reddit friend freaked out. Quote, this woman opened her cards and she saw and pointed out skin color, height, eye color, and profession of every single love interest in my life at the time, and which ones were in love and others which were badly intentioned. I was spooked the whole time. This woman knew about travels and work prospects and everything. It was scary." Coming in at number 7, Manchek Swamp. During the 1860s, Julia Brown was a well-respected healer and midwife who resided in a small village called Frenye. At first, she loved caring for her village, but after some time she started to feel disrespected by her community, feeling as though they were taking her gifts for granted. Julia began scaring the village, telling them dooming predictions about their impending deaths, and the townspeople, unsure if she was placing a curse or foretelling their future, became very troubled. Shortly before her own death, she said, "One day I'm gonna die and I'm gonna take you all with me." And just days after she was buried, 3 entire villages were destroyed by a hurricane and hundreds of lives were lost. To this day, many believe the spirit of Julia Brown haunts the swamp, and visitors who have visited report hearing blood-curdling screams and the sound of her voice singing cryptic and frightening songs, terrifying all those who walk by. Coming in at number 6, Alice's grave. Alice died in the 19th century, and although she led a fairly normal life while alive, her death and afterlife were anything but. She was laid to rest in an above-ground grave, but soon after, many of the townspeople began to question, was Alice a witch? It said in the middle of the night, the large slab of marble covering her grave was removed on 3 separate occasions, and each time her remains were left outside of her grave. No one stepped forward admitting to have moved Alice or the slab, which led the people to believe that Alice was a witch trying to escape her grave and haunt the town. Eventually, large, heavy iron bars were placed over the grave in an attempt to
to hold her spirit inside, but this hasn't seemed to stop her, as locals claim you can still see her wandering the wooded cemetery at night. But just exactly what is she looking for? That is one of the many unanswered questions that leave visitors terrified, unsure if she comes in peace or if she is out for revenge. Moving on to number 5. Bell Witch Cave. One of the most well-known haunted locations, the tales of it being haunted by an evil entity go back as far as the early 1800s and have been very well documented throughout the years. As the story goes, sometime in the late 16th century, there was a huge feud between two neighbors, John Bell and Kate Batts. Now, Kate believed that John had cheated her somehow on a land deal, and so to seek revenge would routinely harm his daughter. This of course made John act out, and the two spent most of their lives trying to get back at one another. In fact, she was so hell-bent on revenge that the feud even lasted until her very dying breath. On her deathbed, Kate, who was believed by all in the town to be a witch, allegedly cursed the entire Bell family and promised she would haunt them for the rest of eternity. Ever since that day, a terrifying entity is said to haunt the cave. Even Andrew Jackson, former president who spent a night there, once famously said, "I would rather face the entire British army than to spend another night with the Bell Witch." Coming in at number 4, a satanic idol. In 1991, a hunter was walking through the woods on the lookout for deer when he began to feel an overwhelming sense of paranoia. At that very moment, he turned around to see this creepy doll leaned up against a tree staring at him, and he could have sworn that it appeared out of nowhere. Immediately, the hunter knew he should not be here, and so he began walking as quickly as he could to find a way out of the forest. Then, suddenly, an old man dressed in black robes appeared beside him. He looked like a priest, the hunter thought, but something wasn't quite right. Every step he took, the priest matched him, but eventually he decided to ask the priest how to get out of the forest. Creepily, the priest did not speak, instead just pointed off into another direction, turned around, and left the man alone. Now, luckily, the hunter escaped, and the following day, after telling his friends the strange events, they suggested that he reach out to Ed and Lorraine Warren. Upon telling them his story, they explained that the priest was actually a well-known member of a satanic cult, and that the creepy doll he encountered was actually an idol used for ritual purposes. Then the Warrens, being who they were, ventured back into the forest, found the doll, and brought it back home. Soon after, however, strange things began happening. Allegedly, one time Ed was speaking with Lorraine, turned away for a second, looked back, and she was suddenly 30 feet away and passed out on the ground. He called the ambulance, and she spent the next 3 days in hospital, in and out of consciousness, and according to Ed, she actually levitated. Moving on to number 3. Bear Walker. Next up is a story from a now deleted Reddit account about the time they came into contact with a bear walker, which in indigenous cultures is depicted as an evil sorcerer who uses sacred medicines for evil. According to our friend here, quote, "I was 20 years old and very healthy. One night I had a dream I was in a field and was picking wildflowers. From each direction a tornado was coming at me. I woke up in a fevered sweat. That began 2 months of sheer misery. My doctor kept saying that I had a UTI, she would give me antibiotics, and it would subside for a while. I lost 40 pounds in the span of 2 months. By the end of it, I couldn't walk and barely ate." Reddit user says her family grew concerned and convinced her to go to a hospital, and after an ultrasound, they found a huge growth on her ovary. The user continues, quote, "A few days later, I had surgery, and when the doctor came to visit me, he said he had never seen anything like it. It was a yellow, almost concrete-like substance around my ovary. I got better, but my mother remained unconvinced and scheduled an appointment with a medicine man. According to Reddit user, the medicine man said a woman saw her at a powwow, became interested in who she was because of her mother, and must have thrown a piece of medicine in the path which she stepped on. Quote, "He asked me if I still felt it. I said yes. He took a bone, what kind find, I'm not sure, placed it in the area and began to suck. He started vomiting yellow. He gave me medicines and rituals for my mom to do. I went home that night and slept for 13 hours. My sickness never returned. Coming in at number 2, lechuza. Our next story comes from Reddit user Zerora, and for reference, a lechuza is a witch that transforms into an owl. Quote, I was out at a friend's ranch with my buddy, a cousin of mine, a mutual friend, and my buddy's dad. We were putting up some fence posts and barbed wire so we could corral some stray cattle and keep them there until we found the owner. The sun was setting, so we decided to call it a day. We built a bonfire close by and huddled up in an unfinished ranch hand's house. We were drinking and just shooting the breeze and telling stories from high school. Eventually, we got to stories about the paranormal. Once I got to describing the lechuza, we heard an ungodly screech, almost ear-piercing. We all turned to look in the direction of the screech, and before my eyes can adjust to the darkness, I hear my buddy scream, "Es una lechuza!" and he hauls ass to the main ranch house a few hundred yards away. I turn back towards the darkness and I see a giant silhouette of an owl perched on one of the posts we had driven in earlier that day. It was massive. Scared shitless, I decided to run back to the ranch. I finally reach the ranch house and my buddy's dad demands to know what is going on. Reddit friend tried to calm him down, but eventually decided he would go to check out if the witch was still there. But when he arrived back at the tree it was perched on, the only thing left were giant claw marks. And last up in our number 1 spot, on the trail. Last up is a story from a now deleted Reddit account, but our Reddit friend begins by saying that they used to live in a really small town as a kid and that they would often play on the trails near the forest after school with their friends. Quote, one day we were walking a trail and a lady in her mid-50s or 60s came out of the woods. She had dirt all over her hands and pants. She said her car broke down and she needed help. We said we would go tell our parents to come help, but she insisted we come into the woods. We said no and kept walking, and she just stared at us. It was like she just shut off as a person when we told her. The smile went away. Even when we were a couple kilometers down the road, we could see her staring at us. Anyways, we get back to my friends and we're playing tag or something in his backyard, and one of us starts making fun of the lady we saw earlier, and out of nowhere he is launched into his parents' shed, breaks the window and his arm. We all stand in shock. His parents come out and start yelling at us, blaming us and saying we threw him. To this day, we all seem to have the same recurring dream or seeing the woman in the woods, except every time I dream it, she is closer and closer to us.